Up on the bluff, we saw the first dead Yankee. He lay stark and cold in death upon the hillside among the trees in the gloom of the gathering twilight. The pale face turned toward us, upon which we looked with feelings mingled with awe and dread.
The Battle of First Manassas, otherwise known as the First Battle of Bull Run, was the first major battle to be fought between the armies of the United States and the Southern Confederacy. On the 21st of July, 1861, three newly formed armies clashed along the Bull Run Creek near the vital railroad hub at Manassas Junction in the plains of northern Virginia. Battle forged the reputations of several leaders, tarnished that of others, forced hard lessons to be learned, claimed the lives of many, and removed any notion that the war would be a quick, bloodless affair. Using software developed by War Game Design Studio, we present a tactical analysis of the Battle of First Manassas, which depicts the battlefield with a north-oriented map and each hex representing 125 yards. From this vantage point, we cover the critical fighting at Blackburn's Ford, the Stone Bridge, Matthews Hill, Henry Hill, and Chin Ridge. After decades of internal tension aggravated by unresolved constitutional interpretations, the institution of slavery, and unprecedented economic and geographic growth, 7 southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, following the election of the Republican candidate for president, Abraham Lincoln. Peace was soon shattered when the newly installed Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, decided to fire upon Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor upon hearing that President Lincoln intended to resupply federal garrisons stationed there. The bombardment and subsequent surrender of Fort Sumter outraged the Lincoln administration, which promptly called upon 75,000 men from the remaining states to form an army to violently coerce the Confederacy back into the Union. However, Lincoln's call for troops caused 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, who were sympathetic to the notion of secession, to also leave the Union. With 11 states already out and the loyalty of several more coming into question, President Lincoln hoped to quickly march an army south and defeat the Confederacy before the crisis escalated. In response to the impending invasion, Confederate troops quickly assembled to defend their new capital located in Richmond, Virginia, forming 2 armies to protect the northern approaches to the state. The Army of the Shenandoah, commanded by Brigadier General Joseph Johnston, protected the lower Shenandoah Valley from Federal incursions. The other, the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter, began constructing defensive positions behind the meandering Bull Run Creek, just 20 miles southwest from Washington, D.C., near a railroad hub known as Manassas Junction. Manassas Junction was a vital strategic asset for the Confederate forces defending northern Virginia. It was here where the Manassas Gap Railroad broke off from the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. From the rail line running west along the Manassas Gap, troops and supplies from the lower Shenandoah could easily be moved from Johnston to Beauregard. From south along the Orange and Alexandria, men and material from central Virginia, Richmond, and the rest of the Confederacy were shipped north. With Confederate forces concentrating around northern Virginia and in the Shenandoah Valley, Lincoln appointed Brigadier General Irvin McDowell to take command of the newly formed Department of Northeastern Virginia, with the expectation he would soon march against the secessionist capital. General McDowell organized his army of 35,000 men into 5 divisions, commanded by Brigadier General Daniel Tyler, Colonel David Hunter, Colonel Samuel Hunselman, Brigadier General Theodore Runyon, and Colonel Dixon Miles, each containing between 2 to 4 brigades and several batteries of artillery. Amongst the infantry, artillerists, and cavalrymen was a battalion of U.S. Marines, which was attached to Colonel Hunter's division to fight as infantry. As McDowell assembled his army, Beauregard's Army of the Potomac, numbering roughly 22,000 men, continued to prepare defenses along Bull Run Creek. Beauregard had divided his army into 8 brigades commanded by Brigadier General Millage Bonham, Brigadier General Richard Ewell, Brigadier General David R. Jones, Brigadier General James Longstreet, Colonel Philip St. George Kock, Colonel Jubal Early, and Colonel Nathan Shanks Evans. Toward the Shenandoah Valley, another Union army of 18,000 men, commanded by Major General Robert Patterson, was situated near Harper's Ferry to protect against any Confederate movement towards Washington, D.C. through the lower Shenandoah Valley. Opposed to Patterson was Johnston and his Confederate Army of the Shenandoah near Winchester with slightly over 12,000 men divided into 4 brigades, commanded by Brigadier General Thomas Jackson, Colonel Francis Bartow, Brigadier General Bernard B., and Brigadier General Edmund Kirby Smith, as well as around 300 cavalrymen under the command of Colonel James Ewell Brown Stewart and a brigade detached from Beauregard commanded by Brigadier General Theophilus Holmes. As McDowell assembled his army, he came under increasing pressure from the Lincoln administration and the Northern press to begin an invasion of the Confederacy. However, McDowell was worried that his army lacked the training necessary to perform successfully on the field of battle. The majority of his men were new recruits who had little training outside of regimental drill and tactics. Further compounding the issue, few of his commanders had any experience leading units larger than the company level, let alone regiments, brigades, or divisions. Still, Lincoln persisted, reminding General McDowell that the enemy faced the same obstacles in training.
You are green, it is true, but they are green also. You are all green alike.
With a Union army gathering around Washington, General Beauregard entrenched his army along an 8-mile front behind the Bull Run Creek. He anchored his left flank with Colonel Evans's brigade behind the Stone Bridge where the Warrenton Turnpike crossed the Bull Run. Just south of the Stone Bridge was Colonel Cox's brigade, which guarded the Lewis, Balls, and Island Fords. General Bonham's brigade protected the Mitchell's Ford. To the east, General Longstreet's brigade covered Blackburn's Ford, with Colonel Early's brigade in reserve. General Jones's brigade protected the McLean's Ford further downstream, while General Ewell protected the extreme right of the Confederate line, near where the Orange and Alexandria line crossed the Bull Run at Union Mills. Despite having to defend multiple fords between the Stone Bridge and Union Mills, only Mitchell's Crossing was large enough to sustain the movement of an army, allowing the Confederates to easily cover all approaches from behind earthworks. On July 16th, General McDowell, cajoled into movement by repeated cries of "On to Richmond" from the press and the Lincoln administration, began his march southward. He hoped to demonstrate against the Confederate front-line defenses along the Bull Run Creek with a supporting effort while his main effort outflanked the enemy from the south, forcing them to withdraw from their defenses and abandon the Manassas Junction. The next day, General McDowell's army drove away a Confederate screening force around Fairfax before later arriving in Centerville, located just north and east of the Confederate defenses. That same morning, having determined that the Union Army planned to attack along the Manassas line, General Beauregard sent a telegram to General Johnston requesting that he reinforce the Confederate defenses at Manassas. Behind a heavy cavalry screen, the Confederate Army of the Shenandoah marched from its position around Winchester toward Piedmont Station, where it would move by rail to Manassas Junction. They had successfully given the Federals in the valley the slip. Just after General Johnston's army departed, General Patterson sent a telegraph to Washington stating,
I have succeeded, in accordance with the wishes of the General-in-Chief, in keeping General Johnston's force at Winchester.
Meanwhile, hoping to find the Confederate flank, General McDowell ordered General Tyler's division to conduct a reconnaissance in force by marching from Centerville to investigate the area between Blackburn's and Mitchell's Ford. However, he was to avoid a general engagement. Colonel Israel Richardson's brigade took the vanguard and cautiously advanced to Blackburn's Ford, where they were met by Longstreet's brigade of Confederates entrenched south of the Bull Run. The ensuing skirmish was marked by confusion, as the Union soldiers, some of whom were wearing gray uniforms, struggled to engage their elusive foe. The Confederates likewise struggled to maintain command and control, failing to organize a successful counterattack to drive back their enemy. Eventually, Confederate reinforcements from Colonel Early and the Washington Artillery convinced General Tyler that further assaults were unnecessary, and the Union forces withdrew to report their fighting. Although the skirmish was brief, with 83 Union casualties compared to 68 Confederate, it convinced General McDowell that the Confederate right was too strong and that he would have to devise a new way to outflank the rebel army. Following the skirmish at Blackburn's Ford, the Union commander then dithered for 2 days while deciding how to proceed. However, time was running against him as every moment brought additional time for General Johnston's army to reinforce General Beauregard. Further complicating the issue was the fact that many of the 90-day enlistments in his army were about to run out. He fearfully wrote to Washington,
"In a few days, I will lose many thousands of the best of this force."
After hearing reports from scouts that the Confederate left flank was vulnerable, McDowell devised a genius, yet complex plan. He would send Tyler's division to demonstrate against the far left of the Confederate line at the Stone Bridge, while Richardson's brigade pinned down the Confederate right. To the north, Colonels Hunter and Hunselman would march their divisions on a wide flanking march across Sudley Springs Ford to get in the rear of the Confederates. If successful, McDowell's plan would either force the Southerns to withdraw from their defenses along the Bull Run or cause them to be defeated in detail. The plan was not without risk, as it relied on several units acting in concert while spread apart by several miles. Still, with proper coordination, victory was possible. The men were to begin their march in the early morning hours of the 21st. As the sun set on the evening of the 20th, men on both sides contemplated their own mortality. Colonel Bartow tried to encourage his men.
"Remember, boys, battle and fighting mean death, and probably before sunrise, some of us will be dead."
Beginning at 2:30 a.m., Tyler's division moved from its encampment toward the Confederate defenses at the Stone Bridge. While crossing Cub Run, however, the disorganized Federal forces bottlenecked over the narrow suspension bridge that spanned the stream. It was not until 5:30 that the rear elements of Tyler's division completed their crossing, significantly delaying the flanking element's timetable. Around 6 a.m., Tyler's division nears the Stone Bridge. He deploys General Robert Shanks' brigade on the left side of the Warrington Pike with Colonel William Sherman's brigade on the right behind his artillery, with the brigade of Colonel Erasmus Keyes remained in reserve. After deploying his men, General Tyler orders his massive 30-pound rifled artillery piece to fire 3 shots, signaling the beginning of the battle. Across the creek is Colonel Evans's small brigade consisting of the 1st Louisiana Battalion in the left, the 4th South Carolina on the right, and Lieutenant Davidson's 2-gun battery in support. Colonel Evans, a veteran Indian fighter with a penchant for heavy drinking, wisely positioned his brigade on the heights, which during the time of the battle offered a clear view of the Union forces amassing near the Stone Bridge. As the Federals open fire, Colonel Evans keeps his artillery silent to avoid giving away his true strength. Instead, Colonel Evans deploys 2 companies from the 4th South Carolina and a single company from the 1st Louisiana Battalion forward as skirmishers to cover the bridge. In turn, the Federals advance their skirmishers, exchanging shots with their Confederate counterparts across the creek. After a while, with no other Federal advance materializing to his front, Colonel Evans deduces that General Tyler's movement toward the Stone Bridge is only a feint. As General Tyler initiates his holding action on the Confederate left, Colonel Richardson opens his artillery along the Confederate right, even managing to land a shell through General Beauregard's headquarters located at the house of Wilmer McLean. Upon hearing reports of skirmishing along the Confederate left, General Johnston sends forth the brigades of General B and Colonel Bartow along with the Hampton Legion to support Colonel Evans's lone brigade. As the fighting along the Stone Bridge ignited, Colonel Hunter's and Heiselman's divisions continued their march north to outflank the Confederate left. The road they trek is little more than a narrow wagon path, and men with axes were needed to clear the trail. The blazing morning sun baked the men of the Union flanking column as they continued their movement to turn the rebel left. From atop Signal Hill, miles away from the column, a Confederate signalman named Captain Edward Porter Alexander spotted a bright glint off to the left of Evans's position. Upon closer examination, the anomaly in the distance was light reflecting off the muskets and artillery of the Union flanking column. Using signal flags, Captain Porter sends a message to Colonel Evans, warning him to
"Look out for your left. You are turned."
Colonel Evans reacted instinctively, knowing he would be outflanked if he remained in place and that the Army risked being turned if he retreated. Colonel Evans left behind 4 companies of the 4th South Carolina to hold General Tyler in place as he quickly marched the rest of his brigade, around 900 men, to immediately check the Union advance. Colonel Evans and his brigade quickly moved north to Poplar Ford, but noticing that Union troops are further west near Sudley Ford, they dart to Buck Hill. Evans then sends skirmishers forward to check the Union advance near the crest of Matthews Hill. The lead brigade of Hunter's division, commanded by Colonel Ambrose Burnside, crossed the Sudley Spring Ford. The ford acts as a bottleneck, further slowing the Union advance. Moving south along Sudley Road, past the Sudley Church, the Union soldiers had spent their long morning slowly marching to outflank the Confederates, picking berries along the way, and were confident that they had successfully infiltrated the Confederate rear. As the 2nd Rhode Island advanced toward the crest of Matthews Hill, their optimism was quickly dashed by a volley fired by Evans's advanced skirmishers. Surprised by the appearance of rebels to his front, Colonel Burnside quickly sent forth 5 companies of the 2nd Rhode Island who drove back Colonel Evans's skirmishers. The 2nd Rhode Island regrouped and marched across the crest of Matthews Hill, only to be showered by lead fired from the rest of Evans's brigade.
A perfect hailstorm of bullets, round shot, and shell was poured into us, tearing through the ranks and scattering death and confusion everywhere.
While advancing, Colonel John Slocum, the commander of the 2nd Rhode Island, was killed, sapping the regiment's forward momentum. In a callback to Napoleonic-style tactics, Colonel Burnside ordered Captain William Reynolds' 6-gun battery to support the 2nd Rhode Island by firing at close range into the Confederates. However, he kept the rest of his brigade behind the reverse crest of Matthews Hill. Meanwhile, communication issues plagued Hunter's division as they attempted to deploy to face Evans. Half of Burnside's brigade remained in place behind the front lines while the 2nd Rhode Island and Reynolds' battery battled against Evans's Confederates. Colonel Hunter ordered Colonel Andrew Porter's brigade to meet the enemy, but seeing Burnside's 71st New York and 2nd New Hampshire blazing behind the crest of Matthews Hill, Colonel Porter instead began to employ them further back, costing the Union valuable time and squandering their advantage in numbers. Further compounding the confusion, Colonel Hunter was wounded and had to be removed from the field, leaving Burnside in command. He tried to maintain the momentum by ordering the 71st New York and 2nd New Hampshire to advance, but the former regiment was so disorganized as to render it combat ineffective, while the latter began advancing on the wrong side of the Sudley Springs Road. Colonel Burnside then appealed to his last unengaged regiment, shouting,
"Forward, 1st Rhode Island,"
as the men advanced to support their sister regiment. On the Confederate side, after exchanging a few volleys with the 2nd Rhode Island, the commander of the 1st Louisiana Battalion, Major Chantham Roberdeau Wheat, a veteran of numerous campaigns in Central America and Europe, ordered his Louisianians to advance into a perceived gap in the Union line. The Louisiana Tigers, with their colorful uniforms and fearsome reputation, charged towards the enemy, many men dropping their muskets and drawing their bowie knives in the process. However, the perceived gap was quickly closed by the advancing 1st Rhode Island. The Tigers' ferocity could not withstand the sustained volleys of the Rhode Islanders, and they were forced to retreat. In the smoke-filled confusion of battle, the blue jackets of the Tigers confused the 4th South Carolina, who unfortunately fired a volley into the retreating Tigers before command was restored. The 1st Louisiana Battalion reformed to the left of the 4th South Carolina on the opposite side of the Manassas-Sudley Road. This resulted in the right flank of the 4th South Carolina being vulnerable. With his right flank exposed, Evans was in desperate need of reinforcements, and he rode to Henry Hill to confer with General B, who had just arrived with the 4th Alabama and 2nd Mississippi from his brigade, along with Colonel Bartow and his 7th and 8th Georgia, and a battery commanded by Captain John Imboden. General B had observed the battle occurring on Matthews Hill and believed that his position on Henry Hill to be stronger. However, Colonel Evans was determined to hold his position. Relinquishing to Colonel Evans's judgment, General B rode over to the 4th Alabama shouting,
"Up, Alabamians!"
and ordered them to cross the Warrenton Turnpike to the right of the 4th South Carolina. The Alabamians advanced to defend the position, previously vacated by the Tigers, to the right of the 4th South Carolina. Still, realizing that Colonel Evans required more men to hold off the overwhelming Union assault, B brought forward additional units from his command. The 8th Georgia of Colonel Bartow's brigade moved to support the right of the 4th Alabama, while Colonel Evans shifted the 4th South Carolina to the left to make room for B's 2nd Mississippi. Bartow's 7th Georgia was in reserve near the Robinson Farm, owned by one of the few free black farmers in the country, as a reserve, while Imboden's battery shelled the advancing Union forces from atop Henry Hill. In response to the reinforced Confederate line, Colonel Burnside successfully organized the 71st New York, bringing them into battle line between Reynolds Battery and 1st Rhode Island while leveraging the 2nd New Hampshire as a reserve. Colonel Porter, who had just assumed command of Hunter's division from Burnside, organized his brigade for battle on the western side of the Manassas-Sudley Road, while Captain Charles Griffin's 6-gun battery galloped forward to cover the Union right. Fearing that the 8th Georgia threatened his left flank, Colonel Burnside immediately implored to Colonel Porter for reinforcements, exclaiming,
"Porter, for God's sake, let me have the regulars. My men are being cut to pieces."
Porter hesitated, loaning Burnside his most combat-ready troops, Major George Sykes' regular battalion. However, after Burnside expressed that the Confederates could impose themselves between the Federal line of retreat should his flank be turned, Porter relented and ordered Sykes to support the 2nd Rhode Island's left. While the regulars cut into the 8th Georgia, further on the Union right, Porter's men advanced against Evans' dwindling brigade. Captain James Rickett's battery moved into position next to Griffin's to support the advance. Major Wheat was shot through the lungs, causing his battalion's lines to crumble. In the center, the 71st New York brought up their own 2-gun section of boat howitzers to support Reynolds' battery. The situation on the Confederate right became desperate as Sherman and Keyes' brigades from Tyler's division crossed Farm Ford upstream from the Stone Bridge. They realized the area was crossable when a rebel commander rode into the middle of the creek to taunt them. After scaling up the slopes, General Tyler began to array his division into battle lines, overlapping the Confederate right. Heintzelman's 1st Minnesota then fell onto the right flank of the 8th Georgia. Beginning with individuals and increasing to small groups, the Confederates began to withdraw from their increasingly tenuous position on Matthews Hill. Around 11:30, General B ordered a general retreat with the 4th Alabama, attempting to cover the withdrawal. The 8th Georgia routed immediately, even receiving some fire from the 69th New York of Sherman's brigade, as they withdrew in confusion. As the Federals amassed their force of around 12,000 men, the beleaguered and heavily outnumbered Confederates withdrew to the protection of Henry Hill, with the 4th Alabama covering the rear near the Stonehouse. Relishing his victory, General McDowell rode further, shouting,
"Victory! Victory! The day is ours!"
When a nearby Union soldier lamented that he had not yet had a chance to face the enemy in battle, McDowell retorted,
"Shut up your damned head. You'll get chances enough, maybe before this day is over."
As the battered remains of B, Evans, and Bartow's brigades withdrew up Henry Hill, Imboden's artillery kept the advancing Federals at bay, while the 4th Alabama attempted to rally near the Stone House. The only other cohesive Southern unit in the vicinity was the 7th Georgia, positioned near the Robinson Farm. After initially believing the Federals' main effort would occur near Mitchell and Blackburn Ford, by 11 a.m., General Johnston convinced General Beauregard that the Union advance on their left was the main effort, riding toward the sound of battle saying,
"I am going there."
The first to arrive was the South Carolinian Hampton Legion, commanded by Colonel Wade Hampton, which had just detrained after their journey from Richmond and was rushed to support the 7th Georgia at the Robinson Farm. Colonel Hampton positioned them along a fence line facing west toward the advancing Union threat, as he yelled to his unit,
"Men of the Legion, I am happy to inform you the enemy is in sight."
As the Hampton Legion readied their defenses, Lieutenant William Averill, who now commanded Porter's brigade, ordered the 27th New York to attack the remnants of the 4th Alabama near the Stone House. After a brief firefight, the 4th Alabama retreated in disarray up Henry Hill to join the rest of their brigade, reorganizing behind Henry Hill. As the 27th New York launched their pursuit, they came under heavy fire from Imboden's battery. Turning east, they marched up the Warrenton Turnpike to avoid the fire from the Confederate artillery. As they approached the lane leading to the Robinson Farm, the 27th New York was surprised to receive fire from their right from Hampton's Legion. When the 27th New York turned and faced Hampton's South Carolinians, the 7th Georgia advanced close to the rear of the New Yorkers, their blue uniforms convincing the men of the 27th New York that they too were Federals. At close range, the 7th Georgia ended this notion by unleashing a deadly volley into the 27th New York. After a determined firefight, the 27th retreated to avoid the maelstrom of lead. Continuing the trend of sending men piecemeal into battle, Lieutenant Averill sent forth the 8th New York and 14th Brooklyn, and they too fell into the same trap set by the Hampton Legion and the 7th Georgia. After another firefight, the New Yorkers were forced to retreat, but with their position vulnerable to Federals moving toward their right and rear, the Hampton Legion and 7th Georgia withdrew further behind the Robinson Farm. Hampton's South Carolinians and the 7th Georgia succeeded in buying another hour of time for the Confederate forces. As Bee, Bartow, and Evans tried to rally their regiments, a brigade of Virginians under the command of General Jackson began arriving at the top of Henry Hill. As the Virginians took up position of the reverse slope of Henry Hill, Imboden's battery, low on ammunition, withdrew. Wishing to demonstrate the illusion of strength, General Jackson had Captain Imboden unlimber his battery to deter the advancing Federals. As General Jackson examined the deteriorating situation, General Bee approached him while remarking,
"General, they are driving us."
General Jackson chose to position his brigade behind the reverse slope of Henry Hill, out of sight from the Federal artillery on Matthews Hill and Dogan's Ridge. To his front was roughly 300 yards of open ground. From that distance, the Confederate artillery, largely consisting of smoothbore cannons, had a considerable advantage over the Federals with their rifled guns. The reverse slope shielded Jackson's men from incoming artillery, while the open field to their front afforded no cover to an approaching enemy. As Captain Philip B. Stannard and Captain William Pendleton's batteries arrived on Henry Hill, Jackson placed them before his brigade, while allowing Imboden's wary battery to retire. Jackson placed his artillery in such a way that the recoil would push the cannons down the slope, allowing the gunners to safely reload before moving the pieces back into place to be fired again. Following Jackson's brigade were General Beauregard and Johnston, bringing with them additional artillery pieces. As General Beauregard rallied his men, a cannonball disemboweled his horse, but after promptly rising and summoning another mount, his men were stunned by his unflinching leadership, with one remarking,
"I cannot describe to you the effect of his appearance. Indeed, all was changed in a moment. The men brightened up, dressed ranks, and gave a rousing cheer."
With the Confederate line stabilized, Beauregard met with Johnston to assume command of the field, requesting that Johnston guide reinforcements to the battle, which the latter begrudgingly accepted. As this occurred, Colonel Stewart, with his famed 1st Virginia Cavalry Regiment, arrived on Henry Hill, where Jackson requested that he divide his 300 men into 2 sections to protect both the Confederate left and right. As the Confederates reorganized on Henry Hill, the Union forces appeared to oblige them, providing nearly 2 hours of respite for their opponents. Although Burnside's brigade had been bloodied and the 8th and 27th New York rendered combat ineffective, General McDowell still had upward of 15,000 men ready to continue the fight. However, McDowell failed to take advantage of his success to finish off the remaining Confederates, while his division commanders on the field displayed no initiative. As Union gunners shelled the Confederates on Henry Hill, their infantry patiently waited to attack. Eventually, around 1 a.m., Colonel Keyes of General Tyler's division took up positions across the Warrington Pike from the Robinson Farm. Sensing that the Confederate right flank on Henry Hill was weak, Keyes immediately ordered half of his brigade, the 3rd Connecticut and 2nd Maine, to assault the enemy flank, deciding not to wait for his 2 remaining regiments to catch up. Colonel Keyes' 2 deployed regiments plowed into the Confederate flank, taking the enemy by surprise and pushing back the 5th Virginia, Hampton's Legion, and the 7th Georgia. Although the men from Connecticut and Maine drove the rebels back at least 100 yards, the Virginians were not willing to retire from the field just yet. They rallied and poured fire onto the attacking forces. So devastating was their fire that Colonel Keyes later wrote,
"Exposure to it of 5 minutes would have annihilated my whole line."
Having left half of his brigade behind, and with his division commanders failing to seize the initiative, Colonel Keyes had no support to exploit his temporary success and was forced to withdraw past the Robinson Farm and the Warrington Turnpike in the face of the advancing Virginians and South Carolinians. For the time being, the Confederate line on Henry Hill held firm while General Jackson rode along with his hand bound and a bloody handkerchief after being wounded by Federal fire. By 1:30, General McDowell was ready to launch his first coordinated assault on Henry Hill, ordering his artillery chief, Major William Berry, to direct Captain Ricketts and Griffin's batteries to Henry Hill. Fearing the Union artillery would be annihilated without infantry support, Major Berry begged Colonel Heintzelman for assistance, and the 2 managed to cobble together the 1st Minnesota of Colonel William Franklin's brigade, the 14th Brooklyn and Marine Battalion of Porter's brigade, and the 11th New York of Colonel Orlando Wilcox's brigade. This mix-match assault force of units from 3 separate brigades and 2 divisions demonstrates the absence of command and control that would plague General McDowell for the remainder of the battle. Around 2 p.m., Ricketts' battery rolled up Henry Hill and positioned itself to the south of the Henry House. Immediately, Confederate sharpshooters unleashed a volley from the house into the flank of the Union battery. Ricketts ordered his leftmost cannon to turn and fire directly into the house, scattering the enemy sharpshooters and mortally wounding Judith Henry, an 85-year-old woman who would be the only civilian casualty that day. Griffin positioned his battery to the north of Henry House, and the 2 batteries attempted to bombard the Confederate line almost 300 yards away. However, their rifled cannons proved of little worth against such close-range targets, with their rounds arching over the heads of the Confederates. The Union infantry advanced behind the guns, with the 1st Minnesota taking the right flank, the 11th New York in the center behind Ricketts, the Marine Battalion supporting Griffin, and the 14th Brooklyn in the rear moving up between Griffin and Ricketts. As the 1st Minnesota moved forward with General Heintzelman, they approached within 50 yards of the 33rd Virginia, dressed largely in civilian attire and blue uniforms. Both sides attempted to identify the other, but it was the 33rd who realized the identity of the enemy first, and they attempted to fire a volley into the 1st Minnesota, but overshot their targets. However, the 33rd managed to adjust their accuracy and fire hot lead into the ranks of the Minnesotians. Toward the center, the 11th New York tried to support the 1st Minnesota, but became the victim of crossfire from the Confederates, which also hit many of Ricketts' gunners. As the line began to break, Captain Ricketts called out to his infantry support,
"For God's sake, boys, save my battery,"
which encouraged a few of the infantrymen to hold the line, while many retreated. On the left of the line, the Marines were also in dire straits. These were not the battle-hardened Marines from the Corps' illustrious history, as many had only been with the battalion for a few weeks. With their right flank wavering and having suffered several casualties, the Marines joined the retreat off Henry Hill. And although several groups of Marines would partake in future assaults, the battalion would not fight as a cohesive unit for the duration of the battle. As the Union line retreated down Henry Hill, Colonel Stewart, guarding the left flank of the Confederate line along the Manassas-Sudley Road, charged directly into the retreating Federals, engaging them in hand-to-hand combat. After a brief fight, the Federals retreated into the safety of the woods across the Manassas-Sudley Road, and Colonel Stewart withdrew to continue guarding the Confederate left. While Stuart's men regrouped on the left, the Confederates who fought on Matthews Hill began to rally. General B approached his 4th Alabama, pointed towards Jackson, and shouted,
"There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians."
The 4th Alabama promptly moved to the left side of the Confederate line. Meanwhile, as the shattered Union forces reorganized, the 14th Brooklyn advanced forward to support Ricketts's battery as the 38th New York moved behind Griffin's battery. Further back, the 1st Michigan of Wilcox's brigade and the 5th and 11th Massachusetts of Franklin's brigade moved up the road toward Henry Hill. The fighting on Henry Hill had lasted around an hour thus far, and both Griffin and Ricketts's batteries were already shot to pieces, with the latter losing most of their horses. Attempting to retain the initiative, Griffin ordered a 2-gun section of his battery to move behind Ricketts and take up position to fire down the left flank of the Confederate line. Watching Griffin's section deploy 200 yards to their front, Colonel Arthur Cummings, commander of the 33rd Virginia on the Confederate left, determined that his inexperienced troops could not sustain a close-range bombardment from Griffin's redeployed section. After weighing the consequences of staying put, Colonel Cummins ordered his regiment forward. Observing the 33rd Virginia advancing toward his section, Captain Griffin ordered his guns to be loaded with canister. However, before firing, Major Berry ordered Griffin to hold, believing that they were about to fire upon their fellow Union soldiers. Griffin vigorously protested, but Berry did not relent. By the time it became apparent that the advancing Confederates were indeed not friendlies, it was too late. The remaining gunners retreated, and the 33rd Virginia successfully captured Griffin's section. Their success would not last long. After losing Griffin's 2 cannons, McDowell ordered the 14th Brooklyn to immediately recapture the guns. Dressed in Zouave uniforms, the 14th Brooklyn, with elements of the Marine Battalion, struck the disorganized 33rd Virginia hard, delivering withering volleys and pushing the Virginians back. Exploiting their success, the Federals pushed onward and hit the now exposed flank of the 2nd Virginia. Although the 2nd Virginia tried to refuse its flank in the face of the advancing enemy, the regiment dissolved and retreated with the 33rd. The 14th Brooklyn, with Marines in support, then turned their attention to the Confederate artillery. With his left flank unraveling, General Jackson attempted to rally his men. When a member of the 33rd Virginia approached the general and expressed how the day was going against them, Jackson sternly replied,
"If you think so, sir, you better not say anything about it."
Responding to the mounting crisis, General Jackson ordered his 27th and 4th Virginia to turn left. Readying them in line, he called out to his men,
"Reserve your fire until they come within 50 yards. Then fire and give them the bayonet, and when you charge, yell like furies."
The effect of Jackson's presence was intense, as members of the 2nd Virginia returned to the line next to the 27th. Even further to the left, a hodgepodge collection of the 49th Virginia, 11th Mississippi, and 4th South Carolina moved into position as the 6th North Carolina and 2nd Mississippi trailed behind them. The 14th Brooklyn and their supporting Marines pressed onward and were met by intense fire from Confederate artillery, which staggered the Federals. The 14th and the Marines redressed ranks and pushed forward again, only to be rebuffed by Jackson's brigade. On their 3rd attempt, the situation deteriorated rapidly.
They then deployed and delivered their fire upon us, which together with a crossfire from the bushes and the shot and shell from their battery were so severe that we were compelled to retire.
The Federal counterattack had reached its culminating point, and without additional support, the Zouaves and Marines began to retreat, leaving their dead to represent the high water mark of the United States on Henry Hill, with one member of the 2nd Virginia later commenting,
"The green pines were filled with the 79th Highlands and the red-breeched Brooklyn Zouaves, but the only men that were killed and wounded 20 to 30 yards behind and in the rear of our lines were the United States Marines."
As the 14th Brooklyn and Marines withdrew, Jackson ordered his counterattack, yelling out,
"We'll charge them now and drive them to Washington."
After a brief melee, the Federals retreated, only to then be fired upon by the mixed command of Confederate units that had arrived to secure their left flank. Driving back the 14th Brooklyn and Marines, the 4th and 27th Virginia turned right and then charged Ricketts' battery. With Ricketts now wounded, their infantry support routed, and no horses available to move the cannons, the gunners fled before the charging Virginians. To their left, the remaining pieces of Griffin's battery had already limbered and managed to escape the onslaught. Further south, the colonel of the 6th North Carolina, Colonel Charles Fisher, seized the initiative and recaptured the 2 cannons of Griffin's section from the remnants of the 14th Brooklyn, who were reinforced by the 1st Minnesota and 11th New York. Colonel Fisher attempted to press the assault past Griffin's section, but a bullet pierced his skull as his regiment veered left toward the woods across Manassas-Sudley Road. To the right of the North Carolinians appeared the 1st Michigan, who fired into the rebels' right flank. The combined fire from 3 sides routed the 6th North Carolina, and they withdrew into the woods south of Henry Hill, again relinquishing Griffin's 2 cannons. Having successfully pushed back the 6th North Carolina, the 1st Michigan turned to the left and attempted to recapture Ricketts' battery. They charged up Henry Hill and engaged the 27th Virginia in close quarters combat. However, with casualties mounting and without any support, the 1st Michigan retreated. While the Michiganders withdrew down Henry Hill, organized remnants of the 1st Minnesota, 14th Brooklyn, and 11th New York tried to retake Griffin's section. Jackson quickly adjusted to the oncoming threat, and one Virginian later recorded that the federal charge was
a clear case on their part of self-imposed butchery.
And the New Yorkers and Minnesotans withdrew, leaving more of their dead on the field. The next to advance in the continuing array of uncoordinated federal attacks were the 11th and 5th Massachusetts, who formed up to retake Ricketts' battery. Conspicuously absent was Colonel Franklin, their brigade commander, adding to the confusion as these 2 regiments marched up Henry Hill. Still, the men from Massachusetts held firm as they engaged with the 4th and 27th Virginia, even forcing them to fall back 50 yards. To the left of the 27th Virginia, the 2nd Virginia attempted to retake Griffin's section, but was repulsed by fire from the 11th Massachusetts. By now, Jackson's battle-fatigued and disorganized line was near breaking. Unable to sustain any more fire, the 4th and 27th began to retreat. Seizing the moment, Beauregard personally led the 5th Virginia and the Hampton Legion in a counterattack against the 11th and 5th Massachusetts, ordering his men to
give them the bayonet.
The Massachusetts men fought a back-and-forth battle with the Virginians and South Carolinians.
The shouts of the combatants, the groans of the wounded and dying, and the explosion of shells made a complete pandemonium.
Eventually, the Confederate assault prevailed, and the 11th and 5th Massachusetts were forced off Henry Hill. As the 11th retreated, they received fire from their own men, who mistook the gray-clad regiment for the enemy. On the Union right, the bloodied, but not broken, 1st Michigan, 11th New York, 1st Minnesota, and 14th Brooklyn again rallied into formation to recapture Griffin's lost section. Moving up Henry Hill, the Federals ran into another composite force of Confederates, consisting of elements from the 1st Louisiana Battalion, 4th South Carolina, 7th Georgia, and 4th Alabama. Leading the cobbled-together Confederate force was General B. As they moved to strike the advancing Federals, B was mortally wounded by an enemy bullet, while further to the right, Colonel Bartow, too, was shot and soon died, while urging his men to never give up the field. Despite losing 2 brigade commanders in a short span of time, the Confederates held their ground, and once again, the Union forces were compelled to retreat off Henry Hill. By this point, most of General McDowell's regiments were either exhausted from marching and fighting or too far away to join the fight. The only available reserves were the brigades of Colonel Sherman and Colonel Oliver Howard. McDowell devised a plan where Sherman would assault Henry Hill directly, while Howard's brigade attempted to turn the Confederate left via the way of Chinn Ridge. Colonel Sherman, like most Federal commanders this day, failed to concentrate his forces before assaulting up Henry Hill. While most of his brigade was still marching in column, he sent the 13th New York bounding forward. When they moved close to the remains of the Henry House, the 13th New York heard calls before them that they were about to fire upon their own men. This turned out to be a ruse from the Hampton Legion, who then fired upon the unsuspecting New Yorkers, who stood their ground for the next half hour before retreating. Continuing to send his men in piecemeal, Colonel Sherman ordered the gray-clad 2nd Wisconsin up Henry Hill. where they were met with a barrage of musketry from the 5th Virginia. The 2nd Wisconsin withdrew down the hill, only to be fired upon by friendly forces before order was restored. On their second advance, the 2nd broke into 2 wings and moved slowly up the hill. As they neared the top, they heard cries from their front that they were shooting at their own men. Again, the clever rebels had fooled the advancing Federals. And once the 2nd Wisconsin stopped firing, the South Carolinians and Virginians delivered heavy volleys onto the Wisconsinites and forced them off the hill, where they were again subject to friendly fire. Next into the meat grinder were the Highlanders of the 79th New York. Halfway up the slope, the 79th began to waver as shot and shell pierced their ranks. Yet, the officers rallied their men and they continued their assault. As the Federals closed with the Confederates, they again succumbed to shouts from the enemy saying they were firing upon their own men. The Highlanders held their fire as the 5th Virginia and Hampton Legion delivered several volleys, forcing the 79th to retreat down Henry Hill. The 69th New York was the last of Sherman's regiments to assault the Confederates on Henry Hill. Luckily for them, the 38th New York, which had been idle for most of the action along Henry Hill, fell in to the right of the 69th just as Reynolds' battery moved into position on the hill directly behind the stone house. The 2 regiments moved lockstep up the hill, engaging the Confederates at close range. And after around 40 minutes of fighting, they managed to drive back the 5th Virginia and Hampton Legion. Victory appeared in the Union's grasp, with Captain Thomas Maher of the 69th New York imploring his men to,
"Come on, boys, you've got your chance at last."
McDowell led the 38th and 69th New York forward. He was joined on his right by the reorganized 1st Michigan, 1st Minnesota, 14th Brooklyn, and 11th New York, who once again surged forward to retake Griffin's lost guns. The Union line advanced, but beyond their front, behind the reverse slope of Henry Hill, emerged fresh Confederate regiments commanded by Colonel Kock, consisting of the 8th, 18th, and 28th Virginia. To the south, the 2nd and 8th South Carolina of Bonham's brigade moved in for the kill. Behind them were also Elzey's brigade, which was commandeered by Kirby Smith, which had just detrained and marched straight to the battle. Finally, trailing behind was Colonel Early's brigade, which had redeployed from the Confederate right flank. It was now 3:30, and the tide of the battle rapidly swept against McDowell's army. Kock's 3 regiments, with the survivors of the 5th Virginia and Hampton Legion supporting their right, pushed toward Henry House and Griffin and Ricketts's artillery. The Federal line, exhausted from hours of marching and fighting, collapsed. Toward the Union right, Bonham's South Carolinians, along with Confederate survivors of Matthews Hill, completed the coup de grace. McDowell's assault on Henry Hill ended in a disorderly rout. However, McDowell still had one more brigade at his disposal. Oliver Howard's brigade, positioned on Dogan's Ridge, was ordered to move toward Chin Ridge to strike the Confederate left and rear. Howard deployed his brigade into 2 lines with the 4th Maine and 2nd Vermont to the front of the 5th and 3rd Maine. He then repeated the same mistake many other Union commanders made that day by attacking piecemeal, moving up Chin Ridge with his 1st line while leaving his 2nd line near the Warrenton Turnpike. To protect their left flank, McDowell ordered Sykes' regular battalion to guard against any enemy thrust across the Manassas-Sudley Road. The Confederate infantry on Henry Hill adjusted their ranks to fire upon Sykes' battalion and were reinforced with Captain Delaware Kemper's Alexandria Battery. West of the Manassas-Sudley Road, Elzey resumed command of his brigade after Smith was wounded and deployed his men on Bald Hill, while Early's men moved behind their rear to lengthen the Confederate line. Stewart's cavalry, supported by Lieutenant Robert Beckham's artillery, protected the extreme left flank. As Howard's lead element bridged the crest of Chin Ridge, Elzey cried out,
"Stars and stripes, stars and stripes, give it to them, boys!"
and his brigade poured fire directly into their ranks, stalling the Federals in their tracks. To Howard's right, Beckham's artillery fired into his flank. Realizing the threat before him was greater than expected, Howard rode back to bring up the 3rd and 5th Maine, only to find the regiment shaken by artillery fire. Still, Howard managed to rally his men before sending them into the front line. The position of Howard's brigade was tenuous at best. Toward his right, he saw Early's brigade move against his flank. Howard attempted to refuse his line, but his men interpreted this as an order to withdraw. Although his commanders tried to stem the tide, Howard believed it would be best to pull back. Howard's brigade tried to regroup in a thicket near the Warrenton Turnpike, but it was summarily swept away by the combined forces of Elzey, Early, and Stewart. Sykes's battalion remained the only organized Federal unit on the field, but facing the bulk of the Confederate army, Sykes ordered his battalion to retreat. General McDowell's army had collapsed. Most of the Union regiments and batteries retreated in the direction they arrived, with many crossing the Bull Run either at the Stone Bridge, Sudley Springs Ford, or the Farm Ford. Following the 28th Virginia up Matthews Hill, Stewart pursued the enemy towards Sudley Ford, while Early moved to Poplar Ford. The 8th and 2nd South Carolina, supported by Kemper's battery and a makeshift cavalry battalion, moved east up the Warrenton Turnpike to try and cut off the Federals retreating across Cub Run. As the Federal mob moved through Centerville, the Confederates near Blackburn and Mitchell's Ford attempted to begin a pursuit, but it never materialized. Beaten and broken, McDowell's shattered army retreated towards the safety of Washington. The battle was over. The first major battle of the American Civil War was a rude awakening to both sides. The Confederates suffered 387 men killed, 1,582 wounded, and 13 missing, while the Federals lost 481 men, 1,011 wounded, and 1,216 missing. In addition to the untold number of small arms and equipment dropped along the road, the Union Army also lost between 25 and 28 artillery pieces, many of them rifled. As the Northern and Southern press reported on the battle, the opposing sides devised different names, with the Confederates regarding the fight as the Battle of Manassas, while the Union called it the Battle of Bull Run. With many Civil War battles, the names derive from each side's perceived geographic importance, with the Confederates viewing the fight as a defense of Manassas Junction, while the Union emphasized having to cross the Bull Run Creek. Although the Confederate victory stalled any Union offensive for the duration of 1861, the campaign ended with the armies occupying near the same positions they had before. Yet, gone was the notion that the war would end in a single battle. As 1861 turned to 1862, the Union Army would be forced to take stock and devise a new campaign to invade the South, to reunite the country through the violent force of arms. If you are interested in learning more about the Battle of First Manassas, the Marine Corps Association offers all members battle study packages to help you begin your own research of the battle. Also available to members is more video content, which includes the MCA After Action Review series to discuss the strategic, operational, and tactical aspects of the battle, provide guidance on conducting your own staff ride, and offer wargaming guidance. You can become a member to receive this additional content at www.mca-marines.org. If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you.